Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. On the last episode of the podcast, my colleague John and I talked about the meaning of January 6th and the various narratives that have emerged on the left and the right, with folks on the left insisting that January 6th was an insurrection, plain and simple, that Donald Trump, through his actions and rhetoric, tried to steal the election from Joe Biden by lying about the results, by pressuring Republican senators and Vice President Mike Pence to overturn the state electors, and by encouraging his supporters to march on the Capitol and, quote, fight on his behalf. At the rally before the attack, some of Trump's allies made even more incendiary statements, like Rudy Giuliani, who told the crowd, "Let's have trial by combat." Last week, the Department of Justice charged 10 members of the Oath Keepers, a far-right militia group that supported Trump's efforts to overturn the election, with seditious conspiracy, with seeking to use force to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. The extent to which folks in Trump's orbit knew of these efforts remains unknown. After initially condemning Trump's actions in the lead-up to January 6th, many folks in mainstream Republican circles began to downplay the riot by suggesting it was simply a protest that got out of hand, and by criticizing the left for exploiting the events to characterize all Trump supporters as treasonous insurrectionists. Meanwhile, the number of Republican leaders willing to say that Joe Biden won the 2020 election continued to dwindle. Representative Liz Cheney, who has vociferously criticized Trump's narrative, was stripped of her committee assignments. Over the past couple of months, we've also begun to see certain conspiracy theories spread within the right, that the riot was actually incited by left-wing activists in Antifa, that the FBI was involved, that the media was in on the conspiracy. This past weekend, Trump held a rally in Arizona where he promoted the idea that some of the Capitol Hill rioters were in fact FBI agents seeking to foment the attack. All of this comes in the context of what liberals call the big lie, the notion that the election was stolen from Trump through voter fraud, through manipulation of vote by mail, through collusion with the tech companies. The reality is that tens of millions of Americans believe passionately in Trump's theory of the election. They believe, in good faith, that Stop the Steal is an effort to protect rather than undermine our democracy. And increasingly, they believe that the attack on the Capitol was a false flag operation, that the mainstream media narrative of January 6th is really just a tool of the left to subvert the will of the people and maintain power. I've wanted to dig a bit deeper into some of these narratives for a while, narratives that appear to be hardening each day within segments of the right. But I've wanted to better understand what people actually believe, not just what the media I consume tells me they believe. My guest today was Peter Wood, an anthropologist, a former professor and college provost, and the current president of the National Association of Scholars. He's a conservative member of the Braver Angels Scholars Council, and he's out with a new book called Wrath, America Enraged. In the second half of our conversation, we explored some of his deeply researched and well-developed ideas about America's increasingly angry political culture, how we got here, and what we might do about it. In the first half, however, we talked in depth about the 2020 election and January 6th, and Peter gave voice to some of the theories I've described, theories about Antifa, the FBI, voter fraud. As you'll hear, I didn't seek to fact-check Peter. I sought to articulate my own beliefs based on what I've concluded to be true. Braver Angels doesn't endorse positions or policy, and we believe it is necessary to our project to wrestle with ideas across the spectrum, even when they split our very epistemological framework and challenge our shared reality. I found this conversation fascinating, and I hope you did too. Feel free to let me know what you thought by emailing me at media@braverangels.org. And without further ado, I give you Peter Wood. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
It is my pleasure. I want to probe your diagnosis of how America has become so angry. But first, I wanted to ask about the framing of the book. you described it to me as a summons to conservatives to respond shrewdly to the provocations of those on the left who seem intent on stirring up violence and paving the way for authoritarian rule. Can you flesh that out a bit more?
Well, I can try. I was just before coming on to your podcast, listening to Senator Cruz and Senator Cotton question some officials from the FBI about whether the FBI had either agents or informants who were involved in the Capitol Hill riot of January 6th. Over the course of nearly half an hour, the two FBI officials refused to answer any of the questions or denied any knowledge of the matter, some of which seemed rather absurd, as in not knowing who Mr. Eaps is, the one of the ringleaders who had been on the FBI most wanted list until he suddenly disappeared. That set of interviews that took place this morning, I believe, registers a sense that the FBI is in deep collusion with those who want to portray the riot on January 6th of 2021 as an insurrection against the United States, and to deny that they had any part in inciting the riot that did take place. I take it as now well established, at least well established for more than half of Americans, that the riot, disgraceful as it was something that was egged on by left-wing activists who wanted to create the very spectacle that they then denounced as a insurrection. Now, of course, I know those very words are an incitement to people who think that it was Donald Trump who incited a riot and meant to do that as part of a coup against the constitutional authority of the United States. So here we are at the very beginning of our conversation with this chasm between those who think one reality occurred and those who think a different one occurred. Well, I wrote the book that we're discussing, Wrath, America, Enraged, with a deliberate decision that I wasn't going to try to bridge that chasm. I was going to address myself to the people on one side of it, the side in which I find myself, which is the belief that the American left indeed engaged in a kind of coup in the 2020 election, that election was illegitimate in a number of ways. Its results stand for what they are, but the displeasure, extreme displeasure of many Americans with how the election was handled and what its outcome was, remains a key fact that we need to deal with. Now, there are various ways it could be dealt with. One, of course, would be a genuine insurrection. I see no sign of that ever having taken place or likelihood that it would take place, but I see a great deal of stage management on the part of the left that tries to persuade people that in fact it happened and that there is an eager body of insurrectionists out there willing to carry it forward if only the opportunity came along. And on that basis, they justified putting barbed wire fences and keeping the National Guard on duty in Washington, D.C. for many months after January 6th. We still see in the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post and on National Public Radio repeated claims that should the election not go the way of Republican victory in 2024, the insurrectionists will be back and an all-out civil war will occur. All of that rhetoric, every single bit of it, comes from the left. It is a provocation to the right, and certainly there are people who see themselves on the right who are open to that provocation and who are ready to say, yes, if our rights are going to be denied and we are going to see a form of self-government replaced with an autocracy by the left, we will defend ourselves with violence if necessary. That's empty rhetoric as far as I can see, but it does capture a spirit of profound grievance on the part of American conservatives, and it's a grievance that I share. I wrote my book because I fear that the left might just succeed in pushing some people into taking desperate acts of violence in order to try to preserve what they think of as their liberty. I don't want that to happen. I would rather recognize that the wrath is real, but that it can be channeled into something more productive. What would that more productive thing look like? Well, to give a short answer to it, it would look like parents of school children in Virginia showing up at school board meetings and making known their displeasure at the diversity, equity, inclusion 1619 critical race theory indoctrination of their children. The fact that that expression of displeasure got labeled by the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, as a terrorist act, to me says everything about exactly what's going on. That the forms of dissent that are nonviolent and they're genuinely attempting to make use of the instruments that our Constitution provides for expressing political dissent are being shut off and denied. And if you take away the possibility of expressing anger through the channels that our civil society has made available, what you have left with is this bottling up of rage, which I think perfectly fits the word wrath. That's a bit of an extended answer to your initial question, but that's why I wrote the book, and that's why I'm using that vocabulary.
I want to follow up on two things you mentioned. The first was the January 6th insurrection, and the second was the 2020 election. You suggested that the events of January 6th were incited by members of the left, perhaps in collusion with the FBI. Do you believe there were, say, left-wing activists on the ground in the Trump rally who were responsible for helping direct the crowd toward the Capitol, and then they were the proximate reason for why so many Trump supporters forcibly and violently entered the Capitol?
Well, as to left-wing activists, a handful of people associated with Antifa have been identified by name, who were part of that. I don't believe that the evidence so far suggests that this was a homemade activity by left-wing activists who were encouraging the storming of the Capitol. There may have been some of that, and I think it's worth knowing if we could possibly find out. The only way we could find out is if those thousands of hours of tape that the government has refused to release, the efforts of our law enforcement authorities to identify the participants were openly made available. So we're left in the dark. We don't know who the agitators were who were calling for much of this disruption, except that we do know that a significant number of them were, as the crowd was calling them at the time, feds. The one that is now best known as, I think his name is Ray Epps, a rancher in Arizona, clearly working for the FBI. He was identified by the FBI by name within days of the riot. He was put on the America's Most Wanted list by the FBI, and then without explanation, he disappeared from the FBI's Most Wanted list. Now, officials of the FBI refuse to say whether he was either an informant or an agent. He is publicly available, living at home in Arizona, unmolested by our police authorities. What do we know about Mr. Epps? Well, we know that on the day before the Capitol Hill riot, he was calling for an invasion of the Capitol. We have him on tape saying that. We have him on tape multiple times on the day of the riot, encouraging people to break the barriers, charge the police, enter the Capitol. So were there people calling for something like an insurrection? Absolutely, they were. Who were those people? Well, in the one case where we can actually name the person and see him doing what has been described as an insurrection, that person stands unindicted, unmolested, unarrested, and apparently under the protection of the FBI. Now, that to me is a fact that I think is extremely well known to millions of Americans who watch the alternative news, who've seen Mr. Epps in action, as have I, by not having been there, but having watched the videos of him, and have now seen the FBI pull a blank face, says, Epps, we never heard of him, when he was on their own most wanted list. So are we talking about left-wing activists showing up and encouraging a riot? Possibly that was an element in this, but certainly this was an effort encouraged by officials of the Democratic Party in collusion with some of our law enforcement authorities in the FBI, perhaps other agencies. We also have this deeply mysterious fact caught on videotape of somebody planting bombs on Capitol Hill the day before the riot on January 8th. That person can be seen clearly in the videos. The bombs were intercepted and diffused. And yet to this day, the FBI has been unable to identify with all the resources of the United States government who was planting those bombs and why they were planted there. It gives a very strong suspicion shared by many Americans that that was a false flag operation, that somebody was trying to incite damage, destruction, or maybe just fear on the day before the riot. So we're in very murky waters here. To have this discussion, we end up with, as one person puts it, we're watching two different television programs. On one side, there are these crazy right-wing people who thought that they could overturn an election by charging into the Capitol and stopping Congress from validating the results of the election. On the other hand, we have a great many Americans who think that, yes, some people got carried away and swept into that riot, but for the most part, the people who attended President Trump's rally that day were peaceful. They acted as Trump instructed them to go peacefully to the Capitol and have their voices heard. But when they got there, actually even before they got there were these agitators who were attempting to turn the event into something ugly and destructive, which promptly got turned into an insurrection. But how strange a thing, an insurrection where people showed up with no weapons, where there wasn't a single law enforcement authority injured or hurt, where instead we had the cold-blooded execution of one unarmed rioter and the stomping to death by the Capitol Hill police of another person who was trapped in a tunnel, again, unarmed. We have these instances in which the law enforcement authorities behaved in an appalling way, but so did some of the protesters, but those protesters did so under the incitement of government officials. That's what this looks like to someone like me.
Yeah, I think you touched on something really important, which is that in today's media environment, so much of our understanding of what transpired, what are the facts that transpired on January 6th or during any news event for that matter, are shaped by which sources of media and news that we trust. For my part, I believe, granted, there's a lot of video footage that hasn't been made available, but there's also tons of video footage out there that was taken on social media from journalists, from people who were storming the Capitol themselves. And most of what I saw, keeping in mind that there's no way I could myself review the tens of thousands of hours of video circulating online, showed that the vast majority of people storming the Capitol appeared to be Trump supporters based on what they were saying, based on what they were wearing, etc. It's also my understanding that a significant number of members of the Capitol Police were in fact injured. And I have seen videos of fairly striking physical altercations between members of the Capitol Police and folks who were storming the Capitol. But I think the point about media and trust is really at the basis of this, because there's no way the two sides are going to persuade the other side that their take on what happened is right if they're completely trusting different media worlds that each have their own agenda. And I think the same holds true for people's impression of the 2020 election. And I've been struck by the sheer number of people who believe Donald Trump and believe other Republicans when they say that the election was stolen outright, that there was widespread voter fraud, that were it to be properly acknowledged would have resulted in Trump winning the presidency, in him winning Arizona, in him winning Michigan, in him winning the states he needed to win to achieve 270 electoral votes. Where do you stand on this? Do you believe that to be the case?
In a word, yes. But let me acknowledge that I've done no investigation of my own of this, nor am I an avid consumer of any of the mass media, left-wing or right-wing, on these matters. I get some of it via the internet, but the essence of this seems to me has to do with questions about how the election was staged well before the events on actual election day and the days ensuing. That is, the use of the COVID crisis as an excuse for loosening the way in which an election was conducted, so that we had massive numbers of absentee ballots issued, no proper accountability in how those ballots were returned or how they were counted once they were returned. We were left with a flooding of the offices of the people in charge of running the election with Mr. Zuckerberg's campaign donations that ensured that the oversight of the election in many crucial districts was wholly in the hands of a partisan left. So we had both the peculiarities of a vote that departed from every previous election held in American history, along with a set of officials who were more partisan than perhaps any time since Boss Tweed was running New York City. The world in which this election took place, regardless of what actually happened on election day, was one in which a compromise of the electoral system had been wrought and put into place. That alone, leaving aside the mischief, and I believe there was plenty of it on election day and the days following, to me casts a shade over the legitimacy of this election. It's a shade that I think is testified to by Nancy Pelosi and the other Democrats who are now attempting to force into place a permanent version of the procedures of the 2020 election under the rationale that this is what is needed to preserve democracy. Whereas the other side is simply saying, let every legitimate voter vote, but do so with voter ID. This is another one of these chasms in American life right now. Either you believe that Republicans are attempting to, via racist rationale or something else, suppress the vote of people who should be voting, or you believe that the left is attempting to lock into place a set of procedures that would permit a usurpation of elections from now until the end of time.
Right.
And if that's the choice, I believe that the Democrats here are the ones who are acting more mischievously. Not that there's one side or the other that has a monopoly on virtue. Elections are and always have been fraught with the possibility of mischief. People cheat when they can. Those are reasons why we need to have safeguards over our elections, and that we are living in a time when the safeguards appear to be falling all around us. Right now, the New York City is approaching the idea of allowing illegal aliens to vote in municipal elections. It's appalling to me that we have no electoral system in which most Americans can have confidence that their votes will count. And there is, I think, on the edges of that, though I don't think it would be profitable for us to spend a lot of time discussing it, ways in which the actual counting of votes on election day and days following was corrupt. There were non-votes that were counted. There were things that were represented to be absentee ballots, which to be absentee ballots would have had to have been folded and put in an envelope. We could see piles of them that had never been folded. Those were phony votes, and anybody who's paying attention knows they were phony votes, but they got away with it. All right, well, I'm a grown-up. I live in a city where armed robberies take place every day and people get away with them. Law-breaking, immorality, forms of disregard of human rights are part of what we have to live with in this fallen world. And I'm ready to admit that a corrupt election succeeded in getting its way, and we have to live with the consequences. I think lots of Americans now are deeply regretting those consequences, but there we are. We've got a few more years of it to endure, and endure it we will. So.
Yeah, well, I'm just again struck by the dueling narratives that the left and right believe in good faith. And for me, for example, I generally trust the fairly rigorous audits that were performed in the states that tipped the scale, both of which, Arizona and Georgia, I would say, are controlled by Republicans.
Well, I mean, people who have an R after their name and were elected to office as Republicans are no more trustworthy than people with a D after their names and elected as Democrats. I don't think you can count on party registration as any kind of fire.
Well, I was just noting that to suggest that it's not like the states were completely controlled by Democrats, which I could understand could trigger a more immediate sense of suspicion. And I also do trust in certain mainstream outlets, notably the Associated Press, which conducted a rigorous review of a lot of the anecdotal episodes that were circulating on right-wing media in terms of videos of purported ballot dumps at 3 a.m. or irregularities in envelopes. And they concluded, they essentially debunked all of them. And so I personally, based on my own experience as a consumer of news and doing my best to put aside my partisan blinders, which I freely acknowledge I have, I do trust that analysis, and though those things do give me more confidence in the results of the 2020 election. The other thing that strikes me about this chasm between the left and the right in terms of the narratives in which they believe is how increasingly dangerous it's becoming, because it's no longer seemingly primarily based on ideology, but cuts to the core of our democracy itself. While I do think there are cynical actors and elites on both sides who are operating in bad faith, who are saying things they know not to be true in order to prosecute an agenda, in order to pursue power. I believe the vast majority of Americans on both the left and the right believe in their positions because they believe they are protecting democracy. And each side is accusing the other of deliberately seeking to undermine our democracy. And that kind of chasm is dangerous because it's not a debate about immigration or abortion or taxes. It's a debate in which you think the other side is fundamentally seeking to destroy the ideals on which our country is built. And if you believe that, then you can see how violence could become increasingly justified. It sounds like you don't have a lot of confidence, at least in the near term, that this chasm can be bridged, at least in a meaningful way. How do you see this playing out? And are you afraid that political violence will increase as a result?
Well, I'll take the last question first. I have some fear that political violence will result. I said that already, and I'm concerned that the good faith efforts of people on all sides of this chasm will be needed in order to prevent that from happening. The descent into violence would truly destroy our society in ways that I think are probably unimaginable to most people. And I'd rather leave them unimaginable than to think of what it would mean to have something like a hot civil war take place. As to whether I'm optimistic that there can be a meeting of left and right on this, no, I'm not the least bit optimistic. I think that when political divisions as profound as these occur in a society, a struggle ensues in which one side or the other will ultimately emerge as victorious. It's quite clear to me that the organized left, let's call it the elite, if you want on the left, intends to win that struggle and win it by fair means or foul. The organized right has the deficit that it is nowhere near as organized as the organized left. There's a handful of leaders who have themselves individual followings. Donald Trump is one of them, but nothing like this unified movement that, for the moment, I would say it's Nancy Pelosi's movement, although it might be more orthodox to say that it is Joe Biden's. But in any case, there is this asymmetry right now between left and right. One side far more organized and deliberative about what it wants than the other. The right is deeply dissatisfied. It does believe that our instruments of self-government have been compromised, but I don't think it has found a clear path as to what it should do about that. As to the framing of this, you use the word democracy. I and most of the people that I deal with wouldn't use that word at all. We would say that this is a republic that's under the rule of law. It has some democratic elements to it, but the United States was not conceived by its founders, and it has never been conceived by its leadership as a democracy. It's a form of government that we know from the ancient Greeks and from some other parts of the world, but it's a favorite term of rhetoric by the left, implying that a distribution of wealth, power, resources should be accorded by basically nose count in the population. That's not how our government was set up. It's not how it should work. And if you're going to try to talk with people on the conservative side of the spectrum, you've already polluted the issue by saying that it's a debate over democracy. It's not. I'm not interested in American democracy. I'm interested in having a just and fair republic.
Yes, that's an interesting point. And it's so important to be aware of the language we use when talking about these issues, because one word, democracy, dialogue, common ground, can be perceived very differently by people depending on their understanding of what America is and what it should be. You mentioned Donald Trump. I would be curious to hear your assessment of his role in the enragement of America. My impression of his brand of populism was that it was fairly angry. And I know that he's no stranger to outbursts of anger or ridicule or other emotions that could be grouped in that category, according to my impression. What do you think about those ideas, and more generally, what has his role been in the development of our politics and the tenor of our political conversation?
Well, this is a question which I can really get my teeth into. I've been thinking about it and working on it now for some years. And the book that we're discussing, Wrath, America Enraged, is the second of two books. I wrote one that was published in 2006 titled A Bee in the Mouth, Anger in America Now. When that book came out, I think this is where I will jump in, it was just before the blow up between Donald Trump and Rosie O'Donnell, something that may have been lost in the midst of time for most of the people watching this video, but Donald Trump had refused to fire a woman who had been in the Miss USA or Miss America, I forget which, beauty pageant, and Rosie O'Donnell criticized, and they went back and forth in a public slanging match that went on for months and then for years. Later on, when Donald Trump was associated with the World Wrestling Federation, he staged an event in which the wrestlers, one came out dressed as Rosie O'Donnell and one came out dressed as Donald Trump, and they had at it in a public ring. Well, this spectacle of trading public insults and a kind of histrionic anger, I took back in that time as an illustration of my thesis, which was that America had changed its temperament. And this is, again, it's a long scholarly argument that I can't make in its fullness here, but basically I'm saying that over most of American history, up until roughly the years after World War II, America was dominated by an ethic of emotional self-control, in which public expressions of anger were taken as disgraceful, a sign of personal weakness, that the strong person was one who had that degree of self-control that in the face of provocation would be able to withstand it and respond in a rational and controlled fashion. For various cultural reasons that began to erode after World War II, America fell in love with psychoanalysis, which gave us the notion that anger repressed would come back as neurosis. America fell in love with European existentialism, which said authenticity lay in getting down to the bare bones of anger and that kind of thing. These happened to coincide with the rise of the protest-based movements of women's rights and the new civil rights movement of the era. All of these things brewed for decades. A country or a culture cannot change its temperament overnight, but it enters into the way in which we raise children. And you raise children either in order that they have self-control, or you raise them to be expressive. A term used by lots of sociologists is that the 60s gave us expressive individualism. Well, expressive individualism was already taking form in the 1950s, and it grew ever more intense through the 70s, 80s, 90s. it's interesting to me that all of this happened outside the realm of politics. We were becoming a nation that fell in love with angry expression well before our politicians decided that that was the way they should frame their own campaigns. This thing, which I call new anger to distinguish it from that older ethic of self-control, began to find its way into our mass media. The 1980s saw the rise of talk radio and figures like Rush Limbaugh, who realized there was capital to be had in playing with new anger. It found its way into Hollywood and movies. It found its way into our national sports back in the 80s when we saw tennis descend from a genteel sport into a racket-throwing, cuss out the empire sport. All of this culminated, I would say, in its first crest in the early 1990s, when the press invented this figure called the angry white male. And that became a thing in the presidential election of 1992. It returned in even greater force after the Bush-Gore election in 2000, in which a self-styled angry left really emerged. By that point, we had the internet going full force, and websites like the Daily Kos, which were a kind of all fire-breathing anger all the time. So we began to find our way into a world in which this performative anger, this sense of look at me, I'm angry, and therefore I'm powerful and special, began to become a part of our political world. That happened well before Trump ever set foot on the political stage. We had, again, I'm going to go back to the early part of this century. There was the magazine, The New Republic, which was known for its very staid, careful political analysis. One of its key writers began an article, "I hate George W. Bush, there I said it." He broke a taboo, and that was Jonathan Chait. The taboo that he broke was broken by many others. We began to get the sense that the way forward politically was to become ultra expressive with anger. And I can't talk about it all day on just this program, but that's what Donald Trump recognized and realized. He wasn't by any means the first to, but he branded a form of populism in the 2006 election, in which he recognized that the anger of a multitude of people who had hitherto been marginalized from our politics could be summoned to a political campaign based on legitimating their anger. Now, I would say it would be a falsification of the historical record to say that Trump was the only one doing it. Hillary was doing it too, just with a different class of people. So we began to find ourselves in this realm where our national politics was being played out as an anger contest. That's Trump in a nutshell. He certainly is a populist. He certainly learned to play the strings of the anger symphony, but so were others. I think it is a canard against him to portray him as uniquely angry, or the movement that he gave voice to as one which was alone in drawing on this new emotional dynamics. The emotional dynamics are there for us all the time now in every political direction. The figures who were most temperate in character during this period, who refused to engage in it, were themselves pretty marginalized. I think of someone like Mitt Romney, not someone I greatly admire, but you can't portray him as an angry figure. He just wasn't. He stood aside from it. And it turned out to be a political dead end. Barack Obama posed initially as someone who was going to be calm, unemotional, and unangry, but turned out to be a racial provocateur who did little during his 8-year presidency other than anger people. Without him, there would have been no Donald Trump capable of rallying a populist opposition. These emotional things, just as in a marriage, you can't have just one side that is viewed as the source of trouble. Anger plays out as a duet, and it doesn't mean these two sides look exactly like each other. Each adopts a different style. They play different strategies, just the way people play chess with different strategies. But nonetheless, you have to recognize they're both playing. And I think that's where we are now. Bob Woodward's book, Rage, which came out just at the end of Trump's presidency, does portray Trump as this uniquely rage-filled individual. He has some quotes in it that I think are interesting, where he interviews Trump, and Trump says, yes, I have this ability to touch off rage in other people. But the most interesting part of that long book to me was how little Woodward was able to find rage in Trump himself. He seemed to be this figure who could provoke it in others without actually feeling it. That might be gainsaid by some of his tweets, but the tweets have always been mysterious to me, as in, was he being intentionally a provocateur? Did he mean what he said? I don't know, but it's an open question.
Well, looking ahead, do you see any potential salves or solutions to this worsening blight?
Well, I'm mindful of whom I'm talking to. I understand that Braver Angels thinks that we can talk our way out of this, that it's possible for people of diametrically opposed views to have conversations with each other. And I actually believe that to be true. I live in Upper West Side. I spend a great deal of time in Vermont. I've got a lot of friends who I would say are ardently on the left. I'm not even sure whether they know that I'm not. They frequently speak to me, as many people on the left do, just assuming that you're on your side unless you say otherwise. And I don't say otherwise. I try to be a listener rather than a evangelist of my views. That makes me wonder whether this conversational gambit actually works. It is possible for people to learn to mind their manners and not to respond to provocations with counter provocations. And maybe that's a good thing. In my case, I see it as a necessary piece of my sanity. I can't live in a world totally isolated. And if I were to try to engage everybody who says insulting things to me with an attempt to talk it all the way through, I never get anywhere. I talk to people who, without a moment's hesitation, will say anybody who voted for Trump is a racist. I find that profoundly offensive, but I'm not about to take it on every time it happens. I couldn't. Now, are there people on the left who are encountering something in the opposite form of, I don't even know what it would be, because I don't see it at all. Am I blind to that? Are there right-wing crazies running around New York saying deeply offensive things to people on the left that the people on the left have to swallow? I don't see much swallowing going on the left at all. I see people announcing ardently over the most trivial things, that's racist, that's offensive, that's sexist, that's this, that, or the other thing. A large battery of reactions is available at the snap of the fingers, where people will take offense and say so and expect that their expression of offense will carry the day. Well, maybe that's because I live in New York and I don't see the whole world around me, but I do a lot of traveling too. And it does seem to me that there's something quite asymmetrical about the standoff between left and right here. The left is far more outspoken in its grievances. The right, to the extent that it's outspoken at all, tended to be doing that on social media, and now it's shut out of social media too. So where is it taking place? It's taking place in private conversations. I'm party to some of those too, so I know there's this enormous wrath build up on the part of the right, which feels that its grievances are not only inexpressible through the mass media and through the social media and in personal conduct and conversation with friends and neighbors. Do I sacrifice all my friends and neighbors to my sense of self-righteousness? No, I don't. And I know few others who do as well. I've encountered people who have picked up either my book on wrath or the one that preceded it about the 1619 Project, and who've gotten in touch with me privately to say, I really agree with what you're saying, but how did you have the courage to say it? I would never say anything like that. So I'm baffled as to what could be done to change that dynamic. The left might say it wants dialogue. At the moment anything approaching real dialogue occurs, all bets are off. You come under the hammer of a personal attack, and I've been under that hammer too, so I know what it feels like. At the National Association of Scholars, we keep track of people who have been disinvited, people who have been ostracized in various ways. The cancel culture is a real thing. I'm happy to put anybody on that list, left or right, but it's very hard to find anybody on the left who has been canceled. There are a few, but this is a tactic that the left uses to drive out of campus, out of conversation, out of public view, anybody who dares dissent. Even on things like pronouns. I've had two professors now who lost their jobs because they refused to go along with the preferred pronoun of a transgendered student in their classes. In both cases, they did so on Christian religious grounds. So they had at least the possibility that their school could recognize an exception, but no exception was granted. I just say, wow. I'm glad I'm no longer in the classroom because the students have been raised up to this level of sensitivity where they can turn on the rage switch in an instant. And someone who's spent 10, 15, 20, 30 years becoming a scholar in his field can find himself thrown out unemployed. For what? For using the wrong pronoun? To me, this is a pretty strong indication that the culture wars have now reached a pitch where there is no solution. There's no solution short of one side or the other winning.
Well, I guess I want to finish by asking, what is your call to action for conservatives who are existing within this fever pitch? What is the posture that you summon them to take?
I summon them to take civil disobedience. I want them to engage our political process as fully as they can at every level. They should be running for office. They should be supporting other people who are running for office. They should show up at public events and have their voices heard. What they shouldn't do is ever succumb to the provocation to violence. They should be willing to speak up forcefully. They should be willing to be arrested and hauled away in handcuffs, as has happened now most recently in Rochester, New York, but in other places as well. The willingness of our elected authorities to misuse the powers that they have in their offices to treat dissenters as enemies of the state, have them arrested, is something that we need to endure. I wish that the people held in jail in Washington, D.C. under charges as flimsy as trespassing and have been sitting in jail for 10 months without facing the possibility of trial. Trial dates are put off, evidence is not made available to them. In some cases, they've been in solitary confinement. This is torture. It is mistreatment of people under the rule of law. But we should endure it. We should get to know the names of those people who are suffering this. Those are the martyrs of the conservative movement at this point. Some of them may have disobeyed the law and be subject to rightful penalties if they ever get a trial, but nobody should be sitting in jail without bail, without real legal representation, and without the due process guaranteed under our Constitution. And I'd say the willingness of Americans now to endure that kind of mistreatment, sort of a Bonhoefferian willingness to suffer the penalties that an unjust government metes out on people who disobey its edicts, that's where we need to be. And that's a kind of civil disobedience that has real consequences. It involves being beaten up by state thugs. It involves having your rights, your job, your family taken away from you. All of that's happening right now, invisibly to the left, which pays no attention at all as to how its powers invested in government officials are being abused, but it's happening. And millions of Americans know that it's happening. I think what we ought to be doing as conservatives is making sure that millions more know that it's happening. And we should present it forcefully in the faces of those on the left who think that this is just business as usual, that we have a just government going about its appointed duties and protecting democracy from the rise of a class of white supremacists who want to overthrow the government. That's a fantasy. It's an illusion. It's a lie. But it gets repeated so often that a great many people believe it's true. The only way to answer it is by answering it forcefully, answering it with video where we can, with audio where we don't have the video, answering it by personal testimony, answering it by holding those handcuffs high when the police come and arrest you and walk you out of the school board meeting for having objected to critical race theory being taught to first graders.
It's interesting. I would offer many of those same elements of advice to folks on the left who are angry. Run for office, protest, civil disobedience, but do so peacefully. Do so in a way that is in accordance with the rule of law. Peter Wood, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And our listeners can find Peter's book on Amazon. It's called Wrath, America Enraged. And as I mentioned, Peter is a member of the Braver Angels Scholars Council. So I'm sure we will be working with him again sometime soon. Thank you again.